topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Alise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. If we haven't met before and you don't know me, I'm an organizational psychologist, management consultant, logotherapist, speaker, and author. And my team and I at Gusto now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture and inspirational leadership activated by meaning and purpose for today's enlightened and dynamic world. And did you know that inspired employees outperform their satisfied peers by a factor of 2.25 to 1? In other words, inspiration is good for the bottom line. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com and my personal site, alisecortez.com. Today we have with us Rishad Tobaccowala, who has 4 decades of global and multidisciplinary experience in driving personal, team, and business growth. He most recently served as the global strategist and chief growth officer at the 100,000 plus person marketing and business transformation Publicis Group. He is the host of the What Next podcast and publishes a thought letter called The Future Does Not Fit into the Containers of the Past, which is read by 30,000 every week. He's the author of Restoring the Soul of Business, Staying Human in the Age of Data, which helps people think, feel, and see differently about how to grow their companies, their teams, and themselves to remain relevant in the transformational time. And also Rethinking Work, which helps people thrive amidst the seismic changes that will occur at work due to a combination of changing demographics, new mindsets, the rise of distributed work, and the spread of AI, which is the focus of our conversation today. He joins us from Chicago. Rishad, a very hearty welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on your show.
I'm so glad that you said yes when I reached out to you, because I got to read this amazing book that you put out. I saw you, I forget how I found you on Amazon, but I was just, as I told you in our LinkedIn exchange, devoured your book. It's just what the world and business needs today. Thank you, Rishad.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're so welcome. Well, you, my dear new friend, as a futurist and 40 years of your own experience starting and building companies, have come to understand what's the need, what's behind the need to rethink how we lead and run businesses. And I want to talk about just a few. I know we don't have time to talk about all of them, but just a few of the driving forces behind the need for rethinking business and leadership today. So let's start there.
Absolutely. Well, there are 5 big forces. The first one is societal change, which is aging and declining populations, many generations that work with different mindsets, baby boomers believing in capitalism, Gen Z not. There's obviously the rise of technology, of which AI happens to be one, which is also going to basically change work more than we know it and makes knowledge free to a certain extent. Third is the rise of marketplaces, and those marketplaces could be anything from Amazon Web Services to Etsy to Shopify, that allows people to access markets as well as make themselves available to markets. There is the rise of the gig worker, the side hustle. In the United States, 1 out of every 2 people will get a 1099 this year, not just a W-2, people who work. And finally, there's the long-term impact of COVID, which is in some part on where you work, but more importantly, why you work and who you work for and what you think about work. So those 5 forces, which obviously are interconnected, are the 5 seismic changes changing work.
Just a few to deal with. You know, I have a lot of empathy for the people, the leaders that I work with to help support. This is a hard time to be a leader. And I think your book really beautifully, as I was telling Juan, my executive producer, before we got on, really summarizes and encapsulates just really everything that's there for us. So let's talk next, if we can. You mentioned that among these societal shifts, of course, which are not going away. I personally find it really kind of amusing that people are still saying things like, when we go back to the way things were, why would we want to go back? Why would we want to be a graduate from college and say, second grade back in elementary school was really good. I want to go back to those times, right? I'm just amazed by that. So let's situate next here some of the things that you suggest that organizations reimagine that will help them situate the needs and wants of today's workforce.
Sure. So there are four. So one of the interesting things which I find that people find about my book that they like, which hopefully, as you have indicated, you have liked, is that it's very reasoned, balanced with facts, and then says here are things you want to think about. It isn't a screed that says there is a silver bullet answer. You and I work too much in the real world to believe that there's some silver bullet that someone can find. So with that, what I basically sense is that there are four things that any business of any size should be looking at. The first one really is to think about, do they need a new type of employee? So most companies today have three types of employees, basically a full-time employee, a contract employee who basically appears to be full-time but works for another company really, and you just hire them. And then there's a freelance employee. I believe it's time for another employee, which is a fractionalized employee. So what is a fractionalized employee? They're an employee of the firm with all the benefits that an employee has, that in addition to base compensation, if they're eligible, they have both either equity or bonuses, and they have 100% healthcare, but they only work maybe 60 or 80% of their time. This person is different than the freelance because they have both healthcare and they have benefits, if that makes sense, but different from a full-time employee that they only work 60 to 80%. Why is that a good idea? The reason it is a good idea is it offers the individual and the talent a lot more options than they had before. A lot of people want to spend a little less time working because they may need to spend that time either looking after kids, aging parents, their own health, or following some side passion. It is a good idea for the company because it can attract this type of talent. But more importantly, in an AI age, I think most companies are going to find that they need about 15 to 20% fewer employees to do the same amount of work. And this is a fantastic way of actually having a 15 to 20% savings without having to do any layoffs, without hurting your company. Because in effect, you turn around, you ask everybody, do you want to work 60, 80, or 100%? Some people will say 100, some will say 60, some will say 80. You may end up with about 80% without having to do any layoffs. And in effect, you can then move up and down based on demand and supply. So that's one key thing. Second is, how do machines and human beings coexist? Which is, how do you train? How do you rethink your company for an age of AI where knowledge is free? A third one is, very importantly, to unbundle the office. So I truly do believe that in many, many companies and many, many industries, in-person interaction is important, which is human beings connecting together. But nobody said that that necessarily was ever done most meaningfully in the office. In my career, when we needed to do creative brainstorming, we'd go to offsites. When I wanted to build relationships, I'd go to bars and restaurants. When I wanted to learn, I would go to events. And nobody goes around and bangs into people in a water cooler. We basically, carry our own water bottles. And there's a lot of research that says unless somebody's 25 meters from you, you're not going to bang into anybody in a large company on different floors. So in effect, rethinking the office and rethinking the question, not how do I get people back into the office, but how do I maximize the benefits of in-person interaction while allowing as much flexibility that I possibly can, and also eliminate costs of real estate as much as I can. And the last one, and this one is particularly fun, is I've begun to believe that one of the reasons people are not wanting to come back to the office may not just be because it is a long commute, it's a waste of time, and a whole bunch of other things, but they don't want to come back to the bosses. Mm-hmm. And so one of the key things in my book is what I call about the fall of managers and the rise of leaders. And managers and bosses tend to be people who have zones of control, while leaders have zones of influence.
Right.
Bosses basically want all the people sitting in their seats so they can conduct them. A leader plays improvisational like jazz. And I basically believe those four things: a new type of employee, figuring out how to basically have the machine-human coexistence, rethinking in-person interactions to maximize them with flexibility, and retraining leadership to actually lead versus just be a boss, are the four things every company should be thinking about right away.
Let me comment on a couple of those things. One, the first thing about this idea of a fractionalized employee, I really like that concept, Rishad. I haven't really seen much of that. That's a fairly novel concept to me. And one of the things I like about that is it also allows more people in the full population to work.
Yes.
Giving people more access to the world of work and being able to earn an income for themselves, which I think is going to reduces, the overall lift for us to support everybody in the community. And then, of course, going back to what you're also just saying there, that flexibility piece, offering different ways for people to embrace and engage in the world of work versus what we're seeing today, these forced mandate return to office, same hours. It's so that ability to be able to recognize that the need for that flexibility, you're going to get a much more engaged, motivated, committed person when you offer that flexibility.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the key things is the same companies who basically talk about agility, flexibility, and personalization show no agility, flexibility, or personalization for people coming back to the office, which means they're lying. That's all. It's completely fake. And that's what I tell leaders. The fact that you don't give personalization, agility, or flexibility to your talent, and then you go around telling your customers you're an agile, flexible, and personalized company, how's that work? Please tell me, sir.
Well, speaking of that, Rishad, another thing that I also quite enjoyed about your book is the idea of really encouraging leaders and companies to embrace gig work, side hustles, and passion projects.
Yes.
If you could speak to why there's a benefit for them to do so.
So there are three benefits. So let me begin with the benefit to the talent. To the talent, the side gig and side hustle allows you to basically have your cake and eat it too, to a great extent. I managed to attract and retain world-class talent who might have wanted to have a passion of starting a gaming company. So I said, look, you can work here, work with us on gaming practice and start a gaming company. That's one. The other is what it also basically does is that side hustle or side gig brings skills and credibility to our own clients. Look, this person is doing this other thing. So they get more credible, which is one. They can have their cake and eat it too. And the third is they're maximizing their optionality, which is they now have two revenue streams versus one revenue stream, which also allows them to take a little bit more crap at work because they have an outlier or something, right? So it's really good. Now, for the company, why is it good for the company? It's good for the company, one, because you're reducing your costs without losing your talent. You still have your talent, right? Second is, in most cases, talent loves you even more because now they get to have their cake and eat it too, so they're more likely to be loyal. They're actually likely to work more than the percentage that they said they were going to basically do. Third is you begin to be a place where people who have amazing talent come and work with you because they say they can work with you and do what they want to do. So your costs are better. You've got better people in your culture, and you can attract more talent. So it's a win-win. And why that's very important, especially in the US versus, let's say, Canada or other places, is it's also the only way that people can get healthcare of a particular type. Because unfortunately, the US, outside of the Affordable Care Act, most of your health is directly associated with having a job.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So one of the things that I got from one of my previous guests that I really have not been able to forget, which I want to have you speak to next, is what she's put forth is that the old way that we worked, where we required people to be in the office these certain hours, do the commute and everything else, what it does really fundamentally from a humanistic vantage point is it reduces people's overall potential, their ability to realize more of their potential. It squashes that. And I think you do a really amazing job in your book of describing just how COVID changed our minds. And so can you speak to some of the ways that it did so?
It did. The biggest thing that it did was basically it did four key things to change our mind. The first one was what I basically call existential questions.
Yep.
And existential questions is during COVID, and most of us will still remember, we weren't sure whether we would live. Okay. And we were seeing people who we knew or loved ones being either very sick or sometimes passing away. So you begin to ask a question, what am I here for? What am I doing? How am I using my time?
Yeah.
Right? Am I doing meaningful stuff? So that was the first big thing. That was the thing that I said, what really changed the way people think about work, not just where they work. That was the first thing. Second is while people were doing that, they were beginning to realize that since nobody was looking, they could now do these other things that also fulfill them. Because all of us are multitudes of personalities, right? We're not like bipolar or schizophrenic. It's just we have multiple personalities or multiple interests and passions. And now we could feed all of those because we had the time to do that. And nobody was monitoring and watching and looking. And we said, hey, this is much more meaningful. The third is, hey, you know what? I'm getting a lot done without somebody telling me what to do and having a boss on my head, right? And fourth, when time became very important because we didn't know how long we would live, we began to realize we were wasting a lot of time moving our physical body parts to a place to be in the front of a screen. And usually the technology at the office was not as good as the technology at home. It wasn't as comfortable. And it was loud and noisy because people had removed real estate anyway. So you basically came in and said, wait, that going back to 2019 is not going back to some halcyon days. It's going back to the dark ages.
Right. Second grade. Yeah.
Yeah. It's going back to the dark ages. And my whole basic belief is, why does anybody want to go back to the dark ages?
I don't know. And then a couple of other things you also included in there too is people began to recognize that they were going to reject overwork and burnout as well as toxic work cultures. No,
Yes.
thank you.
No, thank you. And what basically begins to happen is what I always tell people is many companies thought and tried to convince people that they had a culture. But what many companies had is they had a cult. Okay. And a cult requires two things. It requires a compound like Jonestown, and it requires you to drink something all the time, like Kool-Aid. Now people have left the compound because they're at home.
Right.
And they are not being given the Kool-Aid. So all of a sudden, they're opening their mind and saying, oh my God, I was so unhappy. That was actually a cult. It was a toxic place that somehow or the other, I wasn't thinking. It's sort of like this very famous sort of a speech, which is, what is water? Which is a fish, when they're in water, asks another fish, what is water? Right? And sometimes you have to leave to understand exactly where you were.
Yes, and which is why when you and I go into organizations, we can hold up that mirror a little bit more easily than they can see for themselves.
That is exactly right.
All right, let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Rishad Tobaccowala, a futurist and seasoned businessman who helps unleash the superpowers of each individual talent by helping them see, think, and feel differently so they can grow themselves, their team, and their businesses. We've been talking a bit about some of the forces driving the great rethinking. After the break, we're going to get into what work will become. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. As I too am dedicated to helping create a world where people realize their potential at work, are led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness, and we do business that betters the world, I keep researching and writing my own books. So one of my last ones came out. It's called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it in some ways to do some of the things that Rishad is doing to help leaders understand how the world has changed and what does the workplace want and need from them, and then offer 22 best practices that you can start to fold into your culture to help create that. You can find my books on Amazon or my personal site, alisecortez.com. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Rishad Tobaccowala. He's the author of Restoring the Soul of Business, Staying Human in the Age of Data, which helps people to think, feel, and see differently about how to grow their companies, their teams, and themselves to remain relevant in transformational time. And the book that we're talking about today, Rethinking Work, which helps people thrive amidst the seismic changes that will occur at work due to a combination of changing demographics, new mindsets, and the rise of distributed work, as well as the spread of AI. So to kick this part off here, this segment off, Rishad, this is about what work will become. You already situated for us several of those things, including the fractionalized employees, the machine-human coexistence, the unbundling of the office. You did that already for us beautifully in the first segment. If we can start by talking about more of what the office can become, the future of the office. You have at least, I think, 6 different aspects or ideas in your book that really champion what could look like that's much different.
Yeah, so, one of the biggest things is we should think about the office as being a place where people can come to interact with other people because it's being programmed. So you actually have programming. So when people come into the office, I always basically say, what are they going to do here in the office that's different than what they do at home?
Right.
Are they going to listen to somebody? Is there going to be a training program? Are they going to actually have a formal brainstorming? Are they going to go have lunches and dinners together? So, the whole idea is rethinking about it and says, okay, how do I benefit in-person interaction? The other is, in many cases, if for global companies, there may be advanced technology at the offices so that you can better communicate and better connect with people in the company all over the world. But that is increasingly less and less likely because technology is getting better at home. But that's, sort of a second one. The third is for training, for education. So the idea really is to rethink it. But in addition, don't think about where these people come together just being necessarily the office. It could be an offsite, it could be a hotel, it could even basically be using, university spaces during holidays. So it's literally during summer, moving people into a campus for 2-3 weeks where there's dormitories and everything else, and people, get together. So the idea basically is rethinking what do you want to do when people come together, and it is all those things, but no longer necessarily thinking about it in the current office or reconfiguring and rethinking the office, and also doing things like around events. So for instance, if there's a great show, then having things built around the show and buying people tickets for the show. It's those kinds of stuff.
Mm-hmm. That is radically different than, hey, in fact, I just saw this on a chat board recently, Rishad. Somebody was asking about, what are you doing to re-engage people when asked come to, they're still talking about parties and pizza and potlucks.
Yeah. And my whole thing is like, listen, in fact, I'm going to put on LinkedIn something that I found actually somewhere else, but which is what do companies think people want? So companies think what people want is they basically want a big, nice, interesting office space. They want free food and they want some technology. But what people actually want is meaningful work, leadership, autonomy, optionality, good income. None of those are what they're doing when they're basically, my whole stuff is, if you're providing people with free food and foosball, then why don't you basically go and send them to Dan and Buster or Chuck E. Cheese? It's better to do it there.
Completely with you. And this is so, listeners and viewers, we're with you. We're arm in arm on this. We just want to show you that there's such a better way than what many people are probably thinking about today. I definitely want to go into, because of course, so much of my world is also focused on developing managers and leaders. And I really, really like what you have to say about the fall of old managers and the rise of new leaders. And you talk about 5 ways to become a better manager. And I think that really bears, these are very different sorts of behaviors than people have been probably taught or exposed to. If you could talk about those.
Yeah, I would say that, some of the big things which like I will sort of, and I will sort of pull it out so I can give you the entire, sort of list without sort of losing the flow. But the thing that to me is one of the most important things about it is just by basically thinking, what does a leader do? How does a leader spend their time versus how does a manager spend their time? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And so what tends to happen and not that leaders don't have to have some sort of management like jobs or do some management, but a manager spends a lot of their time overseeing, checking in, monitoring, allocating, delegating, right? While a leader tends to basically be much more about creating, making, mentoring, guiding, inspiring. And so the 5 things that I basically sort of mentioned to be a better manager is, one is to basically think about, when you're talking to people, both nuance and personalization. Understand the person who is working with you, and each one has sort of a different personality, and how do you deal with them? And how do you modify things? Second, in many cases, is get people to raise their hand when they need your help versus constantly checking in, right? You don't have to monitor. You don't have to be like a drone, like, hovering over somebody. You can just basically say, hey, look, here is a bat signal, and when you need me, press the button, right? And then I will show up. The third, we underestimate how important communication is, which is continuously keeping people apprised of what is going on. Because one of the things I basically now come to believe is, very much like in science, they say nature abhors a vacuum. When there is a vacuum of information, people make up whatever they think should be there. And usually they make up the most worst case scenario and the most scandalous outcome, right? And so what tends to basically happen, it makes a little bit of time if you actually tell people this. The fourth, which is the thing I've already mentioned, which is, please invest your time more in creating, building, coaching, and servicing versus all this monitoring stuff. And finally, something that is so important, and this, by the way, can be done in any form, is feedback. Because we grow through feedback, both giving and receiving it. But a lot of companies now have become very reticent about giving feedback. They don't even call it feedback. They call it envisioning sessions or something like that, whatever it is. But if you're constantly giving feedback, so when you do, quote unquote, a formal appraisal, it's nothing. The person's already known everything. And you're moving back and forth. And it's just like, okay, the appraisal really is much more, what are some of our goals for next year or the next 6 months, and what have we achieved? So those 5 things, which is nuance, communication, changing to become more of leading like things versus managing like things, providing people with sort of feedback, if that makes sense, and then obviously encouraging employees to signal with a bat signal when they need your help, are 5 ways.
I want to echo a couple of things that you said there, Rishad, and what you also have in the book, which is just tremendous. So listeners and viewers, you got to get the book. There's just so much in it that's going to help you. But one thing you talked about, the constant communication, and this idea of today, people crave being connection. They crave feeling connected to other people. So that connection and communication is so important. And one thing that you say very overtly in your book, which I profoundly agree with, is especially the younger generations resist being monitored. That software monitoring stuff that's going on.
Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible.
It should be outlawed. It really should be. And so that's the first thing I just wanted to echo there. And then the other thing I wanted to echo too, on this notion of really, how to give, good feedback, the kind of feedback that grows people. And I really like what you offer in your book, Rishad, where you're talking about, don't be harsh about it. It's usually, that wasn't good. That's not what I want. It's hey, let's talk about what really good performance looks like. That last project that you just set in, that was where it was at. That's
Right.
great. If we can do more of that over here. So now what you're doing is you're teaching your people to develop greater, deeper skills. You're showing them what's good and right in them already, and you're helping to elevate their performance for the future. And most managers are definitely not doing that.
Right. So the idea always basically is, when you're providing people with feedback, as you say, the key is you can remind them that this time they were not doing it to the potential that they'd done in the past time. Was there something that was preventing them from doing so? Which is, hey, you have done this at this high level today. You didn't do it at this high level. Is there something going on personally? Are you feeling
Exactly.
ill? Right? Or is there a reason? Or is there something that I have set up an obstacle that didn't allow you to do it? So the idea is you're basically not criticizing the person or their potential. You're basically pointing out that this time they weren't working at their level of excellence. And that's so much easier. So the whole idea is you work at a high standard. Today you did not work at that high standard. Can you explain to me, was it something I did? Was there an external situation, or just it didn't happen this time? That kind of thing. That's very, very
Absolutely.
important.
Yeah.
And the other one is to remind them that you have gone through the same thing. So I would basically say, hey, listen, I've gone through the same challenges, and here's how storytelling. So this empathy, storytelling, giving people that you have a sense of belief. So I always say you should leave a feedback meeting with clarity, energy, and belief.
I like that, to be inspired.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's grab our last break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Rishad Tobaccowala, a futurist and seasoned businessman who helps unleash the superpowers of individual talent by helping them see, think, and feel differently so they can grow individually as teams and as organizations. We've been talking a bit this time about what the work will become in the future. In the last segment, we're talking about how to prepare for the future of work. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. If you're just now joining us, my guest is Rishad Tobaccowala. He's the author of Restoring the Soul of Business, Staying Human in the Age of Data, which helps people to think, feel, and see differently about how to grow their companies, their teams, and themselves to remain relevant in the transformational time. And his latest book, which we're talking about today, Rethinking Work, which helps people thrive amidst the seismic changes that will occur at work due to a combination of changing demographics, new mindsets, and the rise of distributed work, as well as the spread of AI. So for this last segment here, Rishad, I want to get as much as I can as well out of you. This has already been nice and dense and tight. You come back at the last section of your book, talking about how you've situated these major seismic shifts here. And so now we want to talk about what organizations and leaders can do to be able to create this future. And one of the things I really appreciate that you say is that many senior leaders are saying, well, the future is too uncertain to make any change right now. And you really push against that. In fact, several of my other guests have also said organizations that don't change are perfectly ripe for disruption. So if you could say a few things about how now, since we're talking about architecting the future of work, what can leaders and organizations do?
Well, one of the biggest things to a great extent, when somebody basically says, I cannot make any decisions because the future is uncertain, I basically say, I just want to let you know, you've just described the inherent reality of life. Life is uncertain.
Yeah.
So in effect, you're basically saying you want certainty when life is not certain. Like, how does that work? So one is you can't do that. But interestingly, there are some things that are tending to be certain, and those certainties make your current business model uncertain, and you're not willing to actually adjust to those certainties. There are certain certainties. So my book basically puts forth certain certainties which are quite shocking for a lot of business people. So one is that increasingly in many, many industries, scale will not be an advantage. So many companies basically say, you know, we've got scale of spending, scale of manufacturing, scale of talent, and AI, these new marketplaces. Else basically is the technology that allows David to bring down Goliath. Now, there's obviously in some industries like semiconductor manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, scale may matter, but not everywhere. That's number one. So, okay, I built a business model where scale will be less important. Second is a lot of people say, I'm going to use AI to make myself more efficient and more effective. I said, that's very cool. But every company is going to basically use AI to be more efficient and effective. So you're not going to go running around saying you're better than another company because you use electricity. You're not going to say you're going to be better than a company because you use AI. The biggest challenge of AI is not how to take your current business model and make it faster and cheaper, but to rethink your business. And the big thing today is companies that rethink their business have to recognize that their opportunities and threats come from outside their category. Very much like the automobile companies saw the biggest opportunity and threat came actually from Tesla and Uber and not from each other. So the first thing to think about is, why does your firm exist? Why is it designed like that when there is no scale advantages? The other one to actually think about, which is even more further, like, you know, front in the whole thing, is why you even organize the way you are. And could it be that in the future, a majority of the work that is done inside your organization is going to be done outside your organization by people who aren't in your organization? And you might say, what are you talking about? Well, that's existing. It exists, for instance, in the world of entertainment. Very few people work at the studios. Right? They work on the show, they work on the movie, they work on the Broadway play or whatever that is. So in effect, that your company is organized wrong, scale may not be the big issue. Those things are all quite certain because of AI, because of distributed work, because of marketplaces. At least get ready for those certainties if you think you can't operate out of, you know, like uncertainty, if that makes sense. And then you have to retrain your people, because everybody basically says, I want to transform my company. And you and I know that companies don't transform, people do. Right? And where are you helping them transform? So it's so obvious. So a lot of people, when they've read my book, say, you make it so obvious, you tell us exactly what are some of the things we should be thinking about and what to do. I said, yeah, which of these makes sense for your category, your country, you should start thinking about, right? And you come up with a solution. I can't tell you what the solution is because I don't know your company, your category, and your current life cycle of your company. But clearly, I can tell you it's not the same as it used to be. And by the way, going backwards, you're not going to find an answer. The answer is you with your partners, and in the future. Your answer is not looking back.
Yeah. I want to echo too this notion of, you know, retraining the workforce. And you also really talk about the importance of embracing a growth mindset. Completely agree and align with that. Everything you've got in your book. I can't argue with anything. But this notion, how many organizations push against investing and developing their people?
Yes, they do. And one of the things I've always basically said is, if you want to transform your company, and because once upon a time I had a big job, and with my teams and with my CEO and board, we did transform a company. And what did we learn? What we learned the hard way was that there are 6 things that make transformation happen. And most companies don't even get the first 3 right, which are difficult in themselves, which is coming up with a strategy, then figuring out what gaps you have. So strategy, I call future competitive advantage. Then what gaps do you have? And that could be either you hire people or do M&A. And then often you do a reorganization. Those are hard to do. And let's say you get those 3 done. What we learned the hard way is that's not enough. 4, 5, and 6 are all about people. But people don't fit in spreadsheets. People are messy, right? So I always basically say, you know, very much like supposedly it was Michael Tyson, but I think it was Joe Louis who said everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. I said, every leadership team, after they have their Excel spreadsheet and their board meetings, gets punched in the face by something called people. Because everybody in their organization basically says, what's wrong with you? And they ask the following 3 questions, which nobody answers. Why is this good for me? I understand it's good for the company. It's good for you big hotshots. Why is it good for me? Right? Nobody's answering that. The next question is, can you tell me how my incentives will change? If you want me to do this new behavior, how will that impact my salary? And if you're basically continuing to promote people who are doing the old stuff and telling me to do the new stuff, I'll do the old stuff. Right? Yeah. And finally, okay, you want me to go in this new direction, maybe because I will grow and you're changing my incentives. That's interesting. Now explain to me how I'm going to learn these new skill sets. Are you going to give me tuition? Are you going to give me resources? Are you going to give me time to self-learn? Where is that? Right? And so basically, a company that wants to get to the future and sees investment in their talent as an expense is lost at sea. Because as I always tell people, in the agency business, they would say our assets go up and down the elevator. Okay. And I said, that's true, but you don't treat them like your assets are going up and down the elevator. Because if your assets were going up and down your elevator, you would invest in your assets. I believe you are treating them as an expense, and your expense is going up and down the elevator. And therefore, you think any investment in your expense is another expense. Yeah. While an investment in an asset grows the asset. And then all of a sudden, everybody keeps quiet and says, oh, what do we do? I said, well, invest in training.
You know, I have had the privilege of working with a leader where we've followed him, I don't know, 4 different places. The very first thing he does when he comes in is he invests in training. The very first thing he does is he comes and he lifts up the team. That's the first thing he does. So I want to just echo that. Okay, now I want to talk about you put forth this idea of how to redesign structures, and you talk about 3 transformations. And the first one that I found so intriguing, again, I never heard this before, is you talk about moving from legacy structures to roots and wings design.
Yeah. So one of the things is the following, which is I do believe, and as someone who worked in the same company, that I believe roots are very important, because roots are the history of a company. Often it's the culture, the story, the founder's beliefs. All those are important. But what happens is if you just hang on to your roots, you become a stump, because you need to grow. And you need to grow in where the future is. So very much like the branches, right? The branches of a tree, right? Basically find a way towards light, because that's what they're trying to do. They're phototropic. So the roots provide them with some water, but they grow looking for light. And then that light feeds the roots. And you need the root and wing design, which means you need both a focus and where you came from, but also very importantly, where you're going. And if you have only roots, you become a stump. And if you're only wings, you become like WeWork, you get blown away, because you don't have any of the discipline and the brand and the financial wherewithal, which you also need. You just can't be like airy fairy, but on the other hand, you can't be like sitting down and looking at your belly button, which is your past. So you have to do the roots and wings. So that's, one of those things. And I have this other thing about jazz versus, classical music.
Yes.
And then the other one is basically thinking about running schizophrenic models, which is one focused on today and one focused on tomorrow, but letting the tomorrow really compete and focus on tomorrow versus having to carry a lot of today.
So good. So much good stuff, Rishad. Okay. So now we're getting close to the end here already. You have a whole chapter on revisioning the work rippled world, if you will. And so, you address what will make future companies great. So if you can say just a little bit about what you're kind of getting at in that chapter.
Sure. So if the future will probably, so I'm increasingly beginning, and I didn't have this line in my book, but as I've been thinking about it, I believe that in the future, what the book says is there'll be fewer companies. Most companies will have fewer employees than they have today. And there'll be very few, very large companies, but there will be. But there will actually be more work and more employment in the future than today, because there will be actually more companies. and the companies will be smaller, but there'll be many. So I call it the whale and plankton model. There'll be some whales and there'll be plankton, and there'll be the occasional squid and shark in between. But it's a whale and plankton model. And in that particular model, a lot of what talent and management are going to have to do is they're going to basically have to run companies in a way that is built on a growth mindset, which is how do we actually continue to basically sort of learn. They're going to have to find ways to basically embrace technology and talent in very interesting, sort of ways. They're going to have to be very good inspirational storytellers, because you're going to have to paint a vision for the future, and you're going to have to get people there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the many things that I gravitated to in your book is how you describe how managers and leaders must evolve. Of course, you do talk about the importance of in terms of the leadership evolution is to prioritize inspiration. And you talk about how many leaders are very, very, very strongly astute intellectually, but incredibly flat emotionally. You talk about the need for faster continuous learning, right? And then also connecting the dots, making sure that you can see how all the things fit together, your synergies, your ecosystems. And then I also can't help but, illustrate this idea that you put forth of the need to learn how to communicate clearly, eloquently, and motivationally. You just sort of mentioned that, the storyteller piece of that. That's the reason, of course, I focus on that, is because that's the world that I also help organizations with too. And it was so heartening to hear you say that, like, oh yes, it's just not me who believes this. There's this.
It's critically important. And as I tell people again and again, there are three things that people forget. One is, Joan Didion had this great line, which is, she was the famous essayist, which is, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Mm-hmm. Okay. And in many ways, all technology is really about enhancing storytelling. And we're living in this AI and other age. So when we had fire, in addition to having warmth and food that we could eat, it also let people gather around and tell stories to each other. Mm-hmm. When you had the wheel, you could visit other places. That's why most stories now start with someone goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town, right? And so there is a direct connection between advances in technology and storytelling.
How terribly enlightening. This has been such a great conversation. I have two last questions for you.
Sure.
They're both kind of fast. One is, since you've written the book, of course, we all know that it takes a long time to write a book. Has there been any other thoughts that you've come to since you've written that book that you want to share? And then I'm going to ask you just to close the conversation.
Sure. So there's one analogy that I've come up with, a line, which is, since I've written the book, which is, in the future, there'll be far fewer jobs than there are today, but there'll be much more work to be done. Okay. And the best way to describe it is that music is the best analogy that I give. In the past, the way if you wanted to listen to music, you had to go where Mozart was playing the music.
Right.
Then you had the gramophone record, but you had to afford it. Then you had the Sony Walkman, you could walk around. Today, we listen to music, which is completely up in the cloud, disconnected from any physical device, disconnected from the song next to it, which the person who made the music might have wanted you to. And how do we listen to music? We listen to music through playlists based on what we need to get done. You want to run, you have this playlist. You want to be calm, you have this playlist, which is either algorithmically created or you hand curate. Does it make sense? So we're living in a world where there is going to be far more music than there is today, right? Far more musicians than there is in the past, but far less of a music industry and far less of CDs and LPs and shops and all of those other kinds of things. And that's where the future of work is going. Fewer jobs, more work to be done.
That is a powerful way to finish the conversation. Anything else you want to say in closing, say in the next 30 seconds?
Absolutely not, accepting, but thank you very much for the opportunity to be on your show, and hope your guests enjoy it.
I learned so much from you, Rishad. You have elevated my heart, my mind, everything. And I really, really appreciate you coming on Working on Purpose, sharing your thoughts and what you've learned over these last 40 some years.
Thank you very much.
Listeners and viewers, you are going to want to learn more about Rishad Tobaccowala, the work he does advising leaders and companies on reinventing themselves and growing, and his books, including Rethinking Work. You can start by going to one of his websites. It's rethinkingwork.io. See you next week for another nourishing and elevating conversation. And remember, work is one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave, and can give us the opportunity to do business in a way that betters the world. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.